It's the Low Tox Life podcast, and I am Alex Stewart, your host. I don't know about you, but in conversations that I've had, something that comes up again and again is how frustrated so many people are with the food system. And today I talked to Jon Steinman, and we are unpacking everything that is wrong, but also building a case for everything that is right if we all participate more actively.
Certainly where I live 5 years ago, when most people in my community noticed that there were empty shelves for many days. And then we had multiple instances of recognizing that the food isn't just there on the store, it comes from somewhere.
He has written a book called A Grocery Story, The Promise of Co-ops in the Age of Food Giants. And let me tell you, this man brings receipts when he steps out just how much more prosperity we could be putting into the food system that we lament having lost, right? I speak to farmers who knew that 2 generations ago, it was a good middle-class job to run a family farm. I speak to grocery store owners, co-ops, scratching their heads, trying to make the margins work. I speak to small businesses who innovate and create incredible things and think, oh my gosh, I've been ranged by the huge supermarkets. I am set for life. All that hard work has paid off, only for their innovation to be stripped from them through margin squeezes, or worse, the supermarket themselves innovating things into their own home brand products and then deranging those small businesses. So I've heard it all. And today on the Low Tox Life podcast, we are having a conversation of both realism and hope. Imagine, if you will, owning a co-op grocery store with 10,000 fellow townspeople. That is what our guest today does in his town in British Columbia, Canada. And they give the food giants a run for their money. It is so inspiring. I can't wait to hook in. Now, if you tune in each week, you know that we can't do this show every week without our incredible Low Tox partners. And of course, there is something in it for you. If you are making swaps, if you have favorites that you're stocking up on, you always need to be tuning in to see what we have on offer. 3 offers with the code LOWTOXLIFE. Make the most of Block Blue Light, Oz Climate, and of course, Pure Earth. All incredible businesses, and the Block Blue Light one is international as an offer. So everyone listening can make the most of that one. Hello, Jon. How you doing?
I'm doing well today, Alex. Thank you. How are you?
I'm great. And what a great way to start my day, chatting to you about more equitable, localized, nourishing food systems. My first question, I'm going to just jump right in, is you dedicate your book to the next 7 generations. And I remember coming across the 7th generation ethos when I was researching for my second book and reading about Indigenous tribes in North America, and that concept being a blueprint for the best possible way to live. When did it first hit you in your life, and what did it mean to you? Did it mean something straight away, or was it a curiosity?
I think for me, coming into my work with food and community development, it was quite informed by this interest to consider the next generation. And when I started to hear this phrase and this saying about thinking about this next 7 generations, it caused me to consider even that idea of the next generation. Like, well, wait a minute, why not consider multiple generations into the future? And I dedicated my book with that opening for the next 7 generations, in part because after I started doing my research for my book, I recognized that for the past 150 years, there has been an evolution in how we get our food, how the food system, which we can talk about later, has formed. And we really are living in what you could say the residual effects, the shadow or the benefits, however you look at it, of the past 150 years. And so it occurred to me after I did that research into my book, the initial research, particularly the history of grocery stores and the history of cooperatives, which we'll speak of as well. I recognize that, this is actually a time frame that makes so much sense, because what we do today will now ultimately affect people 150 years from now, which is about 7 generations. Part of, I think, the great law of peace, where the 7th generation principle comes from, it sort of says, we're not borrowing this world from our ancestors, we're inheriting it from our children.
Yeah.
And I think when we think about how we eat and how we source our food and the impacts of the food system, it's quite refreshing to begin to expand that timeline, where it doesn't have to feel like there's this sense of urgency that something needs to be fixed tomorrow, but that we can actually take some time to really think about what's the long-term investment of our work in changing the food system.
And there aren't many professions that think that way. But in a past life, I was a national training manager and brand ambassador for one of the world's best cognacs. I mean,
Hmm.
yeah, I did have
Hmm.
a career pivot. But I remember visiting Rémy Martin in France and doing training and speaking with the distillers. And they had such a passion for their Louis XIII, which was this cognac that has blends that exist like at 120 years old that are in
Hmm.
the mix of this
Hmm.
particular cognac. And he said, whenever I am working, I am thinking about my great great grandchildren and hoping that they will see the magic of the seeds I'm planting today. And while that has nothing to do with like food, the concept for me is a really beautiful one to be present to and tune into. And I think with this fast paced world, we've almost forgotten the power of that as a guiding light, right?
Hmm. Hmm. And it connects to food in so many ways too. I mean, more recently, I've really been having to field, and I say more recently, but this has been pretty much the past 20 years of my work with food,
Mm.
is fielding concerns around the price of food. And particularly when you're talking about more ethical systems for how we eat and access that food, often the first concern is, well, how do we pay for it? And it's been a really hard question for me to explore. Maybe we'll get to it today, but part of the difficulty is there's often this desire for a very quick response. And,
Mm.
there's a lot of great examples for how we can respond to that quickly. But in the grand scheme of things, if we keep driving the price of food down with those desires or demands, which in many cases we've inherited, we begin to ripple those effects out into the entirety of the system. And what emerges as a food system is one that serves that interest, which of course we now are seeing the impacts of that low price food culture. And so having to balance this real care and concern to ensure people can access food with the long-term impacts of a low price food system, it is this ongoing delicate balance and dance to have to negotiate.
Mm. And can we actually unpack that? So, a low
Mm.
priced food system, it feels like our world wars kind of turbocharged us there with the long life food being needed to be sent out or being needed for times of depression, the safest kind of way to fill up on that
Mm.
day, wherever you were. Like, I know that subsidies were given during those times, and that kind of set up a whole bunch of lobby groups that then kind of didn't want to lose those subsidies. Then we started seeing a proliferation of grain-based snacks on the market, and it then sort of was a race to the bottom from there. It feels like that was a real turbocharge in the last century. Can you add some insights that fill in the gaps of what I just
Mhm.
said, given you literally have studied this for years?
Sure. Well, I opened my book up with quite an extensive history of the grocery store sector. And really, when
Mm.
you look at the history of grocery stores, in many ways, you're looking at the history of food, at least with my focus in North America, in the United States and Canada, particularly. And what I track is before grocery stores existed, we didn't, and we being the we as the humans of the world, we didn't always have grocery stores available to us. And what came
Mm.
before grocery stores were small, what you might consider mom and pop shops on the corner. And you might have an intersection of a major city where there's 4 mom and pop shops on every corner. And there was generally some clerks behind the counter who would serve you that food. And you would order from in front of the counter. You wouldn't pick products like we do today. And there was an evolution, that happened particularly around the early 20th century where those counters started to disappear and we entered into what was the beginning of what we now see, which is the ability for customers and consumers to be able to select foods. And it started to empower people, I think, in a way that people weren't quite used to. But the relationship up until that point was quite communal. People knew their shopkeeper. There were also specialty stores selling, fruits and vegetables. And there was the butcher and there was the baker. And over time, these products started to come into one single roof. And that was the
Mm.
beginning of what we see today. But what I think was so pivotal in the beginning of the 20th century was the shift to what is now this low price food culture. And you start to see signage in front of stores, you start to see marketing and advertising, signage even on the products, advertising and marketing low priced food or low cost food. And that this was really the answer to all of your anxieties in the world.
Mm.
And some would say that this is what compelled and propelled lifestyles that are so sought after in the world now that we see in America, Canada, or Australia, like where you are and other parts of the world, is that we shifted how much money we were spending on food as a percentage of our income from, I think as high as 30% at one point in the early
Wow.
20th century to what in most cases in most countries like where I live, about 10% of our income. And so the the gap was filled with leisure and transportation and services and all these great things that we get to enjoy our lives with, but it came at a cost. And this is some of what I explore in the book.
And my mind goes straight to the hidden cost around health as well. Mental health, community, which you unpack beautifully with what we have to gain by reintroducing co-op structures,
Mm-hmm.
but also the physical health. Like soon your leisure and transport, after a couple of generations of pummeling people's microbiomes with overprocessed cheap foods, we then end up with all sorts of health problems that we then have to start finding money for, that then keeps that low cost food a priority. And it seems like we're stuck in a space from a wider public health perspective. And by that I mean 5% of people can go, Whole Foods are the answer, and going to a few classes and getting my skills up and cooking for my family. How lovely. And I can stay at home and I can find hours to do that in my day. But that's a very small percentage of people. So I feel like it almost feels hopeless sometimes when you look at how we change things for the better for the most of the people.
Yeah, and I would almost propose that like some of that hopelessness is it's coming from not some choice that we in our lifetime have made to pursue
Mm,
this way of eating, and this relationship we have to food. And what I feel like I was afforded by diving so deep into the history of grocery stores was to recognize that so much of what we believe and how we operate in our lives around food has been inherited.
mm,
We are simply, I tell the story in some of the talks I give, public talks, where I share the story of what my first experience was in a grocery store. And, it was sitting in the shopping cart with my mother pushing the shopping cart around and knowing that halfway through the grocery store, I was going to get the Oreo cookies pulled off the shelf and my mother was going to give me one or two. This was my memory of what I learned about what a grocery store is and was. And for the next probably 20 years, I never questioned it. I never questioned how did this relationship begin. And so I think some of this hopelessness is remedied or responded to in a way, or we can turn it into more empowerment when we actually start to look at like what is it we inherited, what decisions did we not make that we simply just stepped into and were born into. And when you look at the history over, say, like I say, 150 years, you can start to see all of these systems that built up over time and why they built up in this way. And that because we now know the architecture of it, we can do something about it
mm.
because we're not reacting anymore. We're kind of getting to the bones of the entire system.
The awareness raising piece for
Mm-hmm.
sure,
Mm-hmm.
massive. And so food system, like it's a term that we bandy about. Everyone uses it when they're
Mm-hmm.
talking about food and access and cost. And what really are food systems as you have come to understand them and explain them?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's something, I've always struggled with because I use the term, as you've heard me now use it a few times here, food system. And I've been using it for, well, 20 years since I really started talking about the food
Mm,
system. And I always hesitated to use it because it's not something that's very easily understood. I feel like that's a lot easier now for me because in the past 5 years, my sense is many people have come to understand that there is something happening behind the shelves of our grocery store. And we had that experience certainly where I live 5 years ago when most people in my community noticed that there were empty shelves for
mm,
many days. And then we had multiple instances of recognizing that the food isn't just there on the store, it comes from somewhere. And so, instead of it being called a food system now, I often call it food supply chains, and
mm,
I oscillate between the two because now we understand that there is a supply chain, a chain of supply starting from the farm, but even before the farm is all the inputs and machinery and equipment that goes into the farm. And so from that point, the resources that go into the farm to the food manufacturers and processors, to the agricultural commodity traders who buy that product from the farmers, of course, those out in the sea who are harvesting fish and other seafood, and then into the food manufacturers and processors, distributors, retailers, and then into our homes. And so when you look at it as a supply chain, this is the system, this is the supply chain that I'm referring to.
okay. And so, food procurement, like you painted the picture of being in your mum's trolley, and that's just kind of how it was. I was in the same type of trolley. First 5 years of my life were in Chicago, and we lived in the suburbs. So, you did go to one of those enormous supermarkets, and that was all there was. I have, like, I was talking to mum about it last week when we were preparing, when I was doing my research for this interview, and she said I didn't even know what a farmer's market was, where I might find one. In London, where she'd gone to university, they were kind of everywhere. It was like you had to bump into one, as well as your larger grocery formats. But a lot of American cities, it seems, really did away with all of that localization altogether. How, if we look at where we live right now, and there's many thousands of people who are going to hear this, and we think, I don't even know where to start. I have never seen anything different to a supermarket. I think of mining towns, regional towns, where you have this crazy irony of a lot of farmers and agriculture, but they can't actually go to a farmer's market or a co-op where they live. They have a huge supermarket that services the town, and then all of the food they're producing is actually going out to these logistics chains that you were talking about. What would someone be able to start tuning into to see if there's an opportunity of localization around them that already might exist? What are some of the things we can search for?
Well, I mean, for starters, it's worth at least checking if those products are on the shelves of your supermarket. I mean, the good news is 20 years ago when I started doing this work, it was almost impossible to find a local product unless it was by virtue of living in a large city and there just happened to be many large food manufacturers in the city. Then sure, there's probably a lot of local food on the shelves. So that, I would say, that would be a good start, because now 20 years later, I think more and more large grocers are considering or choosing to bring in local product. So that would be my first step. And farmers markets also, I think, are becoming more prevalent. If either of those aren't an option, or neither of those are an option, then this is where, I started to explore, like, the creation of supermarkets controlled by the community. And, this has been sort of my journey, is having spent quite a lot of time investing in this question of how do I get more localized food into my home, food that, feels as healthy and nourishing as possible, fresh. I look to farmers markets. I look to innovative models like community supported agriculture, where you invest in the farmer at the beginning of the season and you get a weekly box of fresh veggies or perhaps other foods. These were all amazing initiatives that I was involved in. And as I write about in my book, it was a lot of work. It's a lot of investment of time. I mean, going to a farmer's market might not be that hard of an investment, but it is one extra step out of what most, I think, experience as the routine,
Yeah.
particularly if you're raising a family and you have, kids to feed and your own life to lead. Taking a step out of just that once a week or once every couple week trip to the grocery store is a big deal. And so this is where I sort of pivoted in my efforts, was to look at the grocery store and ask the question, how do we take this really important institution and have more power over it and be able to hold it accountable for what it carries? And so this is where the idea of the co-op model was something that I turned to and got to experience in my community, because luckily for me, I had an opportunity to experience what a co-op was when I moved to where I live now 20 years ago. And, this is the journey I'm on now, is continuing to support this model where we can, as consumers, as shoppers, as eaters, have more power over the future of our grocery store, where it's not just ownership over the stores we can talk about, but you also are owning the shelves, right? You're having a say in what ends up on the shelves of your grocery store.
So good. Because if I think of the duopoly here as we know them, Coles and Woolworths, and you talk about this in your book, where you say there was a point at which large format grocery stores, big corporations listed on public stock exchange style businesses started owning small business. And I've had a lot of friends start beautiful ice cream brands, coffee brands, like incredible entrepreneurial, beautiful, very intentionally thought about in terms of sourcing, equitability, ethics, organics, all the things. And then they start getting completely pressured and backed into a corner. When you've built an entire business, and you have some crazy good examples of this in the book, around being able to do those numbers because you have a Woolworths or a Coles buying from from you and then they change the rules, you can withstand it for a little bit as they say, no, now you have to do 50% off twice a year. And now you have to, and we expect you to do all the marketing to get the people into the stores to buy your stuff. There comes a point where you can no longer do business. And what I thought was really interesting was that you also said they own the small businesses and the brands, but they also own us. And we become a bit enslaven, whether we've realized it or not. Jon, can you unpack how we became owned as consumers and the damage that's been done to some small businesses, many small businesses out there, as like a case for us to now shift our conversation into, okay, this has to change and here's how we're going to do it?
Yeah, well, I think what you're describing is something I call like the passive consumerism, where we are at the receiving end of a system. And, coming back to what we were talking about earlier about the food supply chain and the food system, I just want to maybe offer an image for your listeners as to what that looks like, because I think it helps also come back to your question here. I always see the food supply chain as a series of bottlenecks. And so you have, if you can picture an hourglass, at the top of that hourglass are 500 million people on the planet producing food. And at the bottom of the hourglass are 8 billion of us eaters. And there's not just one pinch point in the middle of the hourglass, there's multiple pinch points. And there was the one I mentioned first, which was the agricultural commodity traders that buy the raw ingredients from the farms. Then you have the food manufacturers, and these little pinch points is where the food is coming through. You have distributors and you have retailers. These are the big 4 pinch points, really. And in each of those narrowing points of the hourglass, there are generally only a handful of companies that control what flows through. And so everything upstream from those pinch points is what, I called the food system. And those companies, generally only a handful in each of those points, those narrowing points, determine really the future of food, because they determine which foods make it to market and which don't, particularly the retailer, because it's that retailer that's the final stage before we access that food. So the retailer, I think, has the most powerful point of determining which foods make it to market and which don't. They're effectively gatekeepers, and they determine the entirety of everything upstream, the supply chain, the food system. In the same way, we as eaters at the bottom, the 8 billion of us, they determine what we eat. It's really that simple. They determine what foods are available to us. And so we have, for now generations, been the passive recipients of that supply chain, of that system. And so there's this belief that we can vote with our dollar. And that's becoming more and more of a myth through my experience. I think there's certainly truth to that, but it's becoming more and more of a myth as fewer and fewer companies are involved in the supply chain, fewer and fewer choice available to us. And coming back to what you were saying earlier with the suppliers, so if you imagine a small coffee roaster, baker, ice cream manufacturer who's creating a really amazing, innovative product using really good, healthy, local ingredients, maybe organic ingredients, and they're trying to get their product to market. Many of those producers, they don't want to stand at a farmer's market. I mean, farmers markets are nice and pastoral and have a really nice feel, and I love going to them. But a lot of those producers, if you ask them, they don't want to be there. And that's not what they do. They produce food, they grow food. This is their specialty. And so, if you only have a handful of companies controlling the grocery store sector, then that's really who these suppliers have to negotiate with. And so in certain cities, like in the United States, you might have Miami, Florida, where one company has half of the grocery market. And so if you're one of these small local food manufacturers in Miami, Florida, then you have one company controlling half of the access to your potential market. And so, coming back to your question around ownership, it's in a way they own the system, they own access to the system, and they own access to us, really. And that's sort of maybe where that idea of ownership comes from that you're speaking.
And so when you realize this, it can be, it's almost like stages of grief, right? You hit the denial, it can't be possible. And then you find out there's like 5 mega corporations that control 80% of the world's food system. And then you're like, how on earth can I see a path through here? Co-ops. Let's talk about it, because I think people might think, oh, I know what a co-op is. It's where we all get our list and we mark down what we want to choose that week, and then we go and we pick it up. Some co-ops make you pack your own things. Some of them have them ready for you. But that's not all co-ops. There are actually different kinds. Can you step us through some of the different types?
Sure. Yeah. So broadly, the word co-op in a more formal sense is a business model that is used globally around the world and has been for over 150 years. And it shows up in many different ways. It shows up in agriculture. It shows up in banking. So for folks who are part of a credit union, those are cooperatives. And cooperatives generally fall into a handful of categories. One would be producer co-ops, where people who are producing a product get together and form another business to support them, whether it's supporting them accessing ingredients for what they do or selling their product. You have worker cooperatives. So these are businesses owned by their workers. And you have consumer cooperatives. So this is kind of, the grocery store model, as well as the credit union model, where the consumers own the business. So it's not a private company in a distant city or distant country. It's actually the people who are using the business that own the business. And that's the consumer cooperative model. So I'll just use myself as an example. I live in a city here in British Columbia, Canada, of 11,000 people. We're a hub for a region with maybe about 20,000. And we have 4 major grocery stores in our community. And one of them is owned by 18,000 people in the community, which is
Wow,
sort of mind-boggling.
18,000 people. No
18,000 people.
way. Okay.
And part of it is
Owned.
that,
Yes, no, keep going. I have questions, but keep
yeah, well,
going.
so, me, myself, I'm an owner. I
Mm.
own a grocery store, so every time, I'm giving a public talk, I'll sometimes joke around and talk about all the businesses I own. And so I'm an owner of a bank. I'm an owner of a network of gas stations. I'm an owner of a grocery store. And what I'm referring to is that I am one of 4,000 people that own my credit union. I'm one of, I think it's about 4,000 people that own a network of gas stations here where I live. And I'm one of, like I say, 18,000 people that own a grocery store. And so here in Nelson, one of the top 4 grocers is a grocer owned by the community, whereas the other 3 are owned, not surprisingly, by the 3 largest grocery businesses in Western Canada. So
Mm.
Loblaw, Sobeys, and the Jim Pattison Group. These are the 3 largest grocers here in Western Canada. And our co-op is competing head on with them. We generate $29 million in sales, and our store has chosen to focus on natural and organic foods. And it is a full service grocery store like you would see anywhere else. And so that's sometimes where things I think get confusing is the word co-op, because sometimes for maybe more informal buying clubs or buying
Yeah, like what I
groups.
was talking about, where you
Yeah.
kind of have the enthusiastic community member who wants to get everybody organized so that we can access like that's quite prevalent in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of those.
Yeah, well, and so here's the interesting part of that is the co-op, like the one I'm a part of, and most of the ones in the United States in particular, formed in that exact way 50 years ago. And so what
Mm.
my story is, and what the almost 280 of them now in the US with about 350 locations among them, all trace their histories back to are groups like that who got together and said, we'd like to buy food together because we want to be more empowered as to what we're sourcing. We want to bring the cost down. And they, create what we would call buying clubs or maybe co-ops, right? But 50 years later, those buying groups can turn into full-fledged grocery stores, as many of them here in Canada and the US have turned into.
Hmm.
And in an extent in Australia as well, there's a small network of co-ops there that are now full service grocery stores.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you talk us through the financials? Like you say you own. Does
Mhm.
everybody, like, do you have an annual general meeting? Are there like financials? Who runs the financials and how do we decide whether they get to represent the finance side of things? And then in terms of employment, because you would obviously have a lot of people. And one thing that I was reading in your book, which I loved, was this model that you're stepping us through right now has a lot more secure employment, secure full-time jobs versus like, your Woolworths down the road
Mhm.
with a ton of casuals and
Mhm.
no income or job security. And for me, as I have often lamented, certainly studying politics and history, seeing things like Citizens United get passed in 2010 in the States, and seeing this hijacking of middle class and lower class opportunity for stability and thriving. It might not be thriving with yachts and country clubs, but it's still thriving. And that's sort of eroding over time. The model you're talking about, John, just fills me with hope that you can actually rebuild these thriving and stable livelihoods.
Yeah, this is one of the many reasons why I'm so passionate about this model is that it really isn't just about shifting the ownership and accountability of the grocery stores in our community. Like these co-ops have really become, certainly mine, one of the most important community institutions. In many ways, they end up serving a lot of the needs that government generally is serving or trying to serve, or we expect them to serve. Co-ops can often do that. But coming back, just to that word ownership, I know it could bring up some fears of risk, like owning a grocery store. Well, I don't want to take that risk. There is no risk. So my experience of becoming an owner involved me spending $50 to buy a share in the co-op. And usually that equity investment can be paid out over many months, or you can pay it all at once. And what that does is it gives me the power to vote once a year for a board of directors. And that board of directors, is made up of members. And so I myself was a board director of my co-op for 10 years up until 2016. And I served 5 2-year terms. And our job on the board is to effectively employ the general manager or the CEO of the business. And then they manage the store. So whereas the early co-ops of like the 1970s and 1980s, like the ones here in the US and Canada, were quite volunteer oriented and participatory and more collectively managed without real like formal hierarchy, many of those in the 1980s shifted to what is now the model, which is much more similar to a traditional grocery store. The main difference being that the owners are the customers, the board is elected by the customers, and then the store is managing itself like any other grocery store. And so the board really just employs that CEO, and the CEO runs the store. If ever I leave the co-op, I can receive that $50 back. It's really just an equity investment. And one of the other benefits is at the end of the year, if the co-op generates a profit, the board and the managers decide what to do with that profit. And oftentimes they will invest some of that profit back into the business, which in that case means everybody benefits, stays in the community. It doesn't get extracted out of the community like any Woolworths or Loblaw here in Canada or Walmart would do. The profits go back into the business, support the community that the business is also supporting, or they actually get reinvested back into the customers, the members. So this year I received $20 as credit on my account because effectively my grocery store, my co-op said to me, hey, we looked at our numbers at the end of the year and we realized we generated a bit too much profit and we'd like to return some of it back to you. It was almost as
my
if
gosh,
my
this
grocery
sounds
store
so
was apologizing
idealistic.
to me.
Wow.
It sounds
That's
idealistic, and
incredible.
that's what's so amazing. It's happening, right?
It's
And
happening. That's it.
it's here.
Okay. And so with the profits, do things, when you say reinvest back into the store, is that about upgrades, maintenance, or adding a new feature, or like, a pipe dream that you had for what you would be able to provide that was going to be too much to do in a regular year? You think, oh, we've got this pot of money, now we can do it. And
Exactly.
does the community also get to decide on some of these, how we use the profits, or is it just the senior leadership teams?
Yeah, good question. There are some co-ops that do enable a portion of those profits to be voted on by the owners. So in some cases, the co-op might propose, hey, we'd like to take some of these profits and invest it in an organization or one of a number of initiatives. That's less common than the norm. And the norm is that, we as customers of the grocery store empower the board to make decisions on behalf of us. And hopefully the board is going to survey its owners and the members to find out what we want. But, when I joined my co-op, we were in the midst of considering building a new store. And so every year, some of those profits were put away to help build that store. And, generally owners might have a say in that, or they might have an influence in deciding whether to do that. Oftentimes, we're empowering the board and the leadership of the grocery store to make those decisions for us. So there's some involvement, but we also are saying, we trust what you're doing. And if we don't, we've got an election coming up and we'll vote for a different board, right? So
It's
it's democratic.
democratic.
Yeah, we're
And
effectively democratizing the economy in this way.
yeah. And do you ever feel a sense of threat by the big guys? Is there a way that they try to threaten the existence and thriving of the co-op?
Well, what's so interesting with that question is there was a time in the mid 20th century, particularly we're now talking sort of post-depression era, where Capitalism seemed to fail. Government was trying to figure out how to respond and did respond in many effective ways. But what the people, the citizenry did at the time, and I'm thinking mostly in the US, and it happened to an extent here in Canada, people started forming co-ops of all kinds to meet the needs that weren't being met by the private sector. And, over time, those co-ops, many of those from the Depression era failed because they didn't have that sort of disruption to help compel what was happening at that time. And bring me back to your question, because I was about to go on a tangent, but I want to come back to what you were asking.
I was talking about, like, is there ever a risk of being taken over by the big guys, or
Hmm.
like a dodgy board member kind of infiltrates, or I don't know.
Right.
Like, I
Right.
think they're worthy questions, because surely there's been a case where everyone looks to one of the people and goes, no, that's not what we want to do here. But maybe, I don't know.
Yeah. So the reason I was bringing up that story is the big grocers at that time saw the threat, and
Mm.
they would publish really talking points and perspectives in media and try to, in a way, align co-ops with communism, which they,
I was going to
in
say, I'm sure someone tried to bring out the socialist card.
we see
Yeah.
it happening
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
It's like that's the part that's so frustrating, is to see that, like, wow, this is the same playbook from almost 100 years ago now, of calling these alternative organizations communist, right? And so certainly the private sector was trying to label co-ops as that. I don't see that happening today, but certainly what I've noticed in the past 50 years is that what co-ops have been able to do is really influence the trajectory of the food system. So
Yeah.
it was the 1970s era co-ops that focused on natural and organic foods that really compelled what today are the organic and natural foods we see in every major grocery store, like Walmart's and Fred Meyer's and Woolworth's, where we can find those products. And so, if anything, yes, they might feel somewhat of a threat, but I think they're kind of seeing co-ops more as research and development. Like, let's look at what they're doing, because that seems to be what's on the cutting edge of what's next. And so I'd say it's less adversarial and more, yeah, let's just learn from them. And to your other point of, can there be disruptions to this very alternative model of ownership? And certainly when you're voting for a board of directors and perhaps the co-op doesn't have a very rigorous nomination process for how those people come into the fold, yes, you can have conflict. We're talking people who are really passionate and therefore opinionated about food and about health and about community. And there is a risk to co-ops because of that, but certainly it hasn't taken co-ops down. Co-ops are thriving. Co-ops are continuing to expand. There's about 100 of them being developed in various stages right now in the US. And so, a lot of those challenges, I'd say, are small compared to the opportunity that co-ops are stepping into.
And how has the agricultural sector seen an opportunity here? Because I'd imagine the relocalization, the more direct buying paths, less travel, less requirement for giant volumes, and more about really nurturing the greater community outside of that co-op structure. Is there always a really positive perception from farmers around and who provide for the co-ops?
Yeah, so my co-op, again, which is, I don't know if I mentioned, the Kootenai Co-op is the name of the co-op. I'm a part of this grocery store here in Nelson, British Columbia. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary.
Wow, congrats. Amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been there for almost half that time as a member, owner, and at times a board director, but always a really passionate eater through all that time. But yeah, so we celebrated our 50th anniversary, and at that dinner, the first of the 2 days, were all the local suppliers from the region who were invited to come to that dinner. And I had a chance to speak with quite a few of them, and the stories are pretty much identical. They all say that this is the store that built my business. If it wasn't for this store, I would not now be in all these other stores. And in many cases, some of these suppliers are selling to the big grocers.
Mm.
And they got their foot in the door through our store, our single store. And that's generally the experience of the people selling into co-ops. Is it's the one place that takes them seriously. It's the one place that cares about them. I speak to other large distributors, like I did not that long ago, who speaks about the way in which, when she calls up the different retailers in the world, on the other end of the line, she says, talking to people from a co-op is always such a more human experience than any other business. And at the end of the day, what co-ops really want to do is they want to make sure that the people producing the food are paid fairly. And so, of course, as a supplier, as someone making food, this is the kind of business you want to work with. And
Yeah.
so, whereas the big grocers will really use that bottleneck in the hourglass to exert pressure on those suppliers and force them to have to pay certain fees in order to get the product into the store because there's no other option. Many co-ops, on the other hand, aren't doing that, and they're really making every effort possible to ensure that these people are treated well and that their food is compensated fairly and they're compensated fairly.
So good. One
Mm-hmm.
of my favorite tables that you include in the book is the remuneration piece and the relocalization percentage of the dollars. And as I was reading it, I was like, man, this guy brings receipts. Like it's so beautifully articulated for people who think, oh, it's just, it is a bit, communist or socialist and everyone's kind of just scrounging around and it feels like it's there's no like we can't be successful and it can't we get the big dollars there and but like if we come back to that idea of thriving and a chance at prosperity for way more people, you show literally how it achieves that to start to gravitate towards these larger format co-ops of mass ownership.
Mm-hmm.
And so everyone's prospering with slightly cheaper groceries. That's like one big tick because of the relocalization. But the wage piece and then the putting of the dollar back into the local community is huge.
Yeah, the supporting a local farmer or local food maker and compensating them fairly is one thing. And of course, there's this mantra that is so common now, particularly over the past 20 years, to buy local. I mean, that's the phrase, right? Buy local. And over time, I think even that term can lose value unless we really unpack like what is actually happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a few stories. There's one I tell in my book, and I'll just share a more recent one because I was asked to create a small film for a food co-op consultant. And I wanted to tell the story of what happens when we buy a local product. And so I've got this carrot cake that I love to buy from my co-op. It's made by a local baker here in Nelson, where I live. And I wanted to find out, when I spend $5 on that really nice piece of carrot cake, where is that money going? And so I asked her, where do you spend your money? And so she gave me a list of all the other places she spends money, which of course are mostly businesses here at Nelson, right? And first she tells me, well, she's got these 2 workers that she employs. And then she also goes to Oso Negro Coffee, which is a local coffee roaster. And she goes to Karama Sushi, which is a local restaurant. And Oso Negro Coffee is owned by someone I know. It's a local business owned by a friend of mine. And I know that business employs other friends of mine. And Karama Sushi is owned by people I know. And it's also a place I like to go and I want to keep going to. I hope it always thrives. And she also mentions that she goes for massages at Vitality Wellness Clinic. And my wife used to work in this clinic,
Oh,
Vitality
wow.
Wellness Clinic. And so when I'm buying this $5 cake, I now know that a portion of that is not just supporting that baker. I'm supporting her workers. I'm supporting this coffee roaster and cafe, and I'm supporting the owners who I know. I'm supporting the people who work in the store who I know. I'm supporting Kurama Sushi. And I'm also supporting that wellness clinic, which employs my wife. And a portion of her wages now is coming right back into my home. And so this is actually this recirculation that you're speaking of, right? Of
Yeah,
how the
yeah.
dollars we spend on food in our community, on local food, on local products can come right back to benefit all of us. And so there's nothing socialist or communist about it. This is the definition of community. This is the
And
definition
thriving
of
local economy.
thriving locally,
Yeah, a
exactly like you say.
100%. And I mean, how exciting that you've basically given us the green light to find the most wonderful local carrot cake to us as a project and find out how the money's being spent out there. I love carrot
Hmm.
cake, so I'm up for that. So good. It really is just so exciting because I think about how you describe, and I think this is kind of greenwashing now in the space of local food buying and quality organic food buying, the Whole Foods brand. And you talk about some of the businesses that were hit in the transition to Amazon ownership. You also talk about how there used to be 11 regional management centers that actually were allowed to localize a lot of what you found on shelves to the region, which was fantastic. I remember reading about the Whole Foods case study like years ago when I became interested in food too. And I thought, wow, they've really figured out a way to do big better. And then along comes Jeff, and it's just people are probably still going there for that Seth Godin, people like us do things like this idea, the romance of if I shop at Whole Foods, that means I care about where my food comes from, and it means I care about organic food for my family. But that's just not the true story of Whole Foods anymore.
Well, and I think what you're speaking to is something even bigger, really, and that's the nature of scale and the trajectory of more and more consolidation within the food supply chain.
Mm.
And I mean, Whole Foods is a great example because here is, I would say, was because it formed as a conscientious business that wanted to do good in the world. And it then followed the same trajectory as many other businesses of acquiring smaller, in their case, natural food stores, small chains. And, they followed that trajectory like all the big stores because they wanted to compete. Right.
Mm.
And in doing that, they started to lose more and more touch with their suppliers, with their communities. There's a story of the first natural foods chain in Western Canada, which formed as an independent natural food store. They grew to 3 stores and they operated with community values, supporting local producers. And because it was privately owned, it left the business open to speculation. And so as the value in natural foods and healthy food began really rising in the 90s, I would say, that business, which was called Capers Markets, based in Vancouver, British Columbia, all of a sudden became really attractive. And they ended up selling that business to Alfalfa's, which is a company in Colorado who had similar values. But of course, what happened to Alfalfa's is it got purchased by Wild Oats, and then Wild Oats got purchased by Whole Foods, and then Whole Foods was purchased by Amazon. And so Amazon got to where it is today through acquisition.
Mm.
And so this is where I started to really understand the value of the co-op model, because there have been companies like Whole Foods and small natural foods chains who have done a lot of amazing work, and there still are many of them. But at the end of the day, the risk is that these are privately owned businesses. And so the future of these stores in our community, the future of their relationships with their suppliers, the future of our capacity to get good local healthy food is determined by a single individual, family, or company.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the end of the day, if the value of these stores increases, like in my example, then we can lose that relationship overnight.
Mm.
And so the co-op model protects the store, because never before has a co-op owned grocery store been acquired by a larger chain. And the
Wow,
reason,
never.
never before. So, which doesn't mean that those stores can't fail, because a co-op grocery store is a business like any other,
Yeah.
and they can fail through poor management, poor strategic direction, you name it. But as a member of my co-op, as an owner of my co-op, I will never show up to my store tomorrow or any other day and all of a sudden see a Walmart sign on it or any other big grocer, because the board at my grocery store, the CEO at my grocery store can't make that decision. If they want to sell our co-op, they have to come to the customers, they have to come to the community and ask permission through a vote. And the customers and owners of the store, of any co-op anywhere, have never said, yeah, let's vote to sell our store. And so this is what makes this model, I think, so important to me, is we can invest all we want into healthier lifestyles and healthier food sources and a healthier food supply chain, but it's only as good as how much we can protect it. And so this co-op model allows us to protect it.
100%. And you speak towards the end of the book about so many community and mental health benefits that you've both witnessed and researched. Can you share a couple of those? Because I think this really brings home the power of a co-op over completely centralized, massive corporation option.
Sure. Well, I mean, some of the ways I think that expresses itself is maybe one funny story in my book is I share the story of some of the early days of our co-op in the 1970s and other co-ops at that time. And there was someone researching co-ops to compare, the difference between these, say, conventional grocers and these generally natural food, organic food co-ops. And he said, the difference is that at these stores, you'll find people put a bumper sticker on their car with the name of their co-op, but you'll never see anybody going to a Safeway or a Woolworths or an Aldi and putting a bumper sticker on their car. And, I use that as an example because it really just shows like the passion and care that people have in their grocery store. And it's not something that we would generally think is possible. Like these are just businesses we walk into and buy food at.
Mm.
And so that just starts to speak to like what else these co-ops are. It's not just about a grocery store that's supplying food. Generally, co-ops are also trying to support communities beyond food. And so co-ops will take those revenues that come into the store and distribute them out to nonprofits. Our co-op generates about 29 million in sales and puts about $160,000 back into nonprofit groups in our community. It's generally a place that people in my community gather, so in some places people don't have that third place, as some might call it, a place to gather in their communities. And co-ops are one of these places that people gather, and people connect their wellness and their community connection to these businesses beyond them just being places to buy food. And I think it's why, when we opened our new store in our new building, as I write about in my book, people walked into the store on that grand opening day and people were in tears as they walked into the store. And so, you're asking about mental health and wellness. And I think a big part of it is the type of connection and community connection people get in these stores. And that also is experienced by the people who can work in these stores. These aren't like perfect workplaces where everybody's happy with their job and their employer. But I can tell you from working directly with co-ops regularly now since I wrote my book, these are people who see it as a gift that they can work in a business that really cares about them and cares about the community, that's doing good in the world. And as a place of employment, they get to walk in and feel like they're doing good work in the world by working at a grocery store. And I
100%.
think that's giving something back to the community.
And that genuine sense of this really means something. This work means something. This food means something. These people that come here mean something to all of us. I would hazard a guess that it would be far more difficult to become radicalized by empty packets and promises of various politicians if you were a part of a really strong community base like this.
Yeah. And, that was also the experience at our 50th anniversary party that my co-op celebrated just last week, where you could really sense that there was this pride and, pride that we had built this store together over 50 years. And of course, I can't put myself in those early days, but there were people there from those days. And to be able to kind of stand there with people who were telling stories of what it was like when there was 3 employees in the store. Fast track to today, there's 160. And to see that like this is a community institution that's been built over time and will sustain itself over time into the future for many generations to come, perhaps for the next 7 generations. That means something more than just some transactional relationship walking into a business. And I think what this communicates through my experience of first really experiencing a grocery store co-op is that this is something that we can apply to everything in our lives. I shared some examples of how I do that in other ways in my life, but really every business and service we use could become a co-op. And we could, as communities, say, we want these businesses and services to always be here. These are important to us. We want them to give back to our community. And rather than demand it from privately owned businesses, we can simply build it into how they do business by forming co-ops, building co-ops, and cooperativizing the entire economy.
Yeah, cooperativizing. Love that
Yeah,
word.
I don't know if that's in the dictionary just yet.
No, I don't think it is, but it's fun to say and fun to hope for. Now, John, one more question, and it's a kind of big one, but I feel like there will be a lot of people going, how do I make this a reality in my community? Is it about simply just putting your hand up to be that person who starts a co-op in any shape or form? So it starts and then over time builds? Is that the history of your co-op?
Well, my co-ops, its history is maybe not as relevant to how you might want to start one today.
Okay.
There are some that do still start that way, where a group of people get together and rather than build a store, they start ordering food together from a distributor. And there's more and more companies out there that distribute foods like that to buying groups. And so I do think that's a very good way to start organizing. You don't have the risk of a building and a storefront. You can operate out of a church basement or your own basement or any public building to distribute that food. But most of the co-ops that are forming now in the US and Canada, they start as a small group that starts to look towards building an actual store. And I'm not going to say that that is easy. But before doing that, I would first check, are there any co-ops already operating in your community? Because there might be one that you don't know about. I'd say if you're in the United States, you could use an app that I made called the Food Co-op Finder. So you can find every food co-op in the US. In Canada, similarly, I've got some on that app too, but there's a whole network of co-ops in Canada that you can find directories for. Australia, same thing. So first look for a co-op. And I think the best thing is to probably join that co-op. And if you want more out of your co-op, you have a voice to hope that it grows and continues to offer more and more products. But if you're starting one, there's more and more organizations that are out there to support starting one. And like you say, it always just starts with one person. Every single co-op that exists today, including my own, began with an idea gathering a group of people and then doing the work and going through the steps of making it happen. And I think what makes the difference between a successful co-op and an unsuccessful one is having your community really get behind it. And so I think part of that is what really compelled me to write my book, is to present the case for why are these important. And if we really understand the system and we understand how vulnerable it is and how we can actually not only make more resilient grocery stores in our community, but they can actually give back to our community and contribute to our communities. The more and more people in a community know that, I think the chances of being able to run a successful grocery store are pretty high,
Yeah.
especially when you start to look at the current climate, which is there's like one or two dominant grocers in any one neighborhood or community. And that certainly doesn't feel very empowering to me. And I think I'm hoping more and more people see that there's another way to engage with our food.
Jon, thank you so much for the work that you do in helping us believe that it's possible, engage where we can, because it really does give a blueprint for a much more hopeful future for localized food systems and more thriving people than just this squeeze to the top that we're all witnessing and most people are now really quite worried about. So I really appreciate you infusing our lives with a bit of hope this last hour, and your book's fabulous. So thanks so much for joining me and for writing.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, appreciate you and your interest in this. And I think, the time is now for something different. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for joining me, and for every comment, review, share, subscribe. It genuinely means the world and it helps grow the show. I'm so glad you're here.